The Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at Villanova University is pleased to host this discussion of the recent devastating explosion at the Beirut port. I'm Catherine Warwick, the director of the center, and I'm happy to introduce our two leading experts on Lebanon. Father Dr. Cale Ellis, who is also the founder of our center at Villanova in 1983, and Dr. Samar Aboud, an associate professor in global interdisciplinary studies. Both of my colleagues are not only experts in the politics and history of Lebanon, they have long-standing personal experiences of Beirut and the country more broadly. So thank you both for contributing your expertise to this discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The explosion 2 weeks ago was such a shocking disaster, and we had images of it right away. You know, these images were circulating on social media and on the news and from so many perspectives that even those of us who are watching from afar had this sort of visceral sense of the extent of the devastation. But a lot of the analysis in the last couple of weeks has been about policy failure. It's been about political prospects. And of course, that's not the only way this tragedy is going to affect Beirut and Lebanon. So maybe the two of you could share your views with us and put it in context for us about, you know, how this is going to affect the Beirut that you've known.
Who would like to begin?
Go ahead, Father Ellis.
Let me, okay.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of the policy views, I think as everyone knows, Lebanon has been in a state of perpetual crisis for the last several years, if not the last more recently, in terms of the financial crisis, in terms of the devaluation of the Lebanese lira for about 80%, in terms of the ongoing strife on the southern border with Israel, between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. There's so many things that have been going on, but I think in particular, the policy issues is that there has been no functioning government, and that the government is also not very well respected, either internally or externally, so much so that with the recent crises and with the explosion is that the government has resigned, but yet they're there on an interim basis. So everyone who looks at Lebanon and who views the situation, you know, talks basically in terms of a sanatio in radice, which is basically Latin for a healing from the root, and that and that sounds good in terms of, you know, yes, you know, we need to have a clean slate, and we need new people to come in, and people that were going to be, you know, certainly honest and competent and this type of thing. But there's never really any follow-up in terms of who those people might be or how that might be affected. And so consequently, we're still in a state of stasis, in the sense that the situation continues on. The same personalities are running events and in charge, and people, I think, have become certainly discouraged and even desperate. And so you hear reports about people who can leave are leaving Lebanon. It's almost like a state of, you know, what happened during the Lebanese Civil War. People just gave up and went away and left the situation. So I wish there were an answer. Personally, I don't have one. You know, how this could be resolved, but we just know that the situation, at least from my understanding of it, is somewhat insoluble. Perhaps Samar has, you know, a different perspective, but which I would really like to hear. But that's where
I agree completely with what Father Ellis was saying. I think what is very difficult about this moment is that there's an accumulation of crisis, an accumulation of hurt, an accumulation of pain that all of us are experiencing and feeling. I grew up during the Lebanese Civil War, but I was the son of Lebanese immigrants, and I grew up in Canada, and I have very clear memories of receiving phone calls early in the morning and the fear that that instilled in my parents, the assumption that an early morning phone call meant something bad happened in Lebanon. The first time that I went to Beirut, I was reluctant. I actually didn't want to go. I was a teenager, but it was right after the Civil War. I didn't want to go because all that I had known of the country was that there was war and conflict. But against my wishes, my parents took us and I had the most wonderful time of my life. But it was immediately after the war. And I remember coming from Canada, being so disturbed by the kind of aesthetic of violence and what it meant to have just been effectively a tourist in a city that had been under siege, going through war for so long. And I know that the last time I was in Lebanon was about a year ago, and that aesthetic from the Civil War is still there.
Oh, Samer, we've
still
lost
see
you on
bullet
audio.
holes. Yeah. Uh-oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're
I
back.
hear
Is
you.
that better? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Maybe I said something Zoom didn't like.
You've been so
But I know one of the things that I kept thinking about when the blast happened was not just what Father Ellis was saying about this kind of crisis over crisis over crisis and this accumulation, but the human toll that this places not just on us. I mean, not just on the people inside of the country, but of course, many of us outside of the country who have very close familial and social connections to it. And for some reason, having lived through there's been the Civil War, there was the 2006 war, the Hariri assassination, and all of these, whether it's skirmishes or big regional conflicts, this seems very different to me. And I say this not the day after, I say it 2 weeks after, because it comes within the context of the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of economic collapse, and the stalling of a revolutionary movement to try and overthrow the government. And as Father Ellis said, I mean, this movement had started before the pandemic and was basically sent home when the pandemic hit, and for safety reasons, people couldn't protest. But I think Father Ellis is right in pointing out the absence of alternatives, the absence of different futures for Lebanon, because the same cast of characters who has been in power effectively since I was a child remain in power in some way. And so the kind of systemic change, the kind of change that could provide security and safety for the people of Lebanon, it's unfortunately not on offer now. And I think this compounds the sadness, frustration, and the loss of hope for a lot of people that are trying to leave the country now.
Just to piggyback on something that Samer just said, I think it's ironic in a way, not ironic. I don't want to read too much into it, but the section of Beirut that was destroyed recently is the same part of Beirut that had been rebuilt after the war, it seems to me. And I mean, that's a supreme irony that those were the sections where the activity was going on, the central area, the Jamaisi area, which is all the nightclubs. Samer, perhaps you would know this better than I in terms of where the hot spots were. But this was kind of the throbbing heart of Beirut, the kind of like the things that people associated with the good life, so to speak. And this was all, devastated, and all that effort to rebuild the city, especially around the port area, where we saw the new, the basin there, where all the magnificent yachts were being docked, by the old St. George Hotel, not far from the Phoenicia Hotel. These other areas, even the center of Beirut, was very, very much affected with damage. So I don't know. I mean, this almost sounds like I don't want to say this, but almost like a retribution for something. but that the fact that all the hard work for the last 25 years, was somehow, somehow not a target, but somehow it just affected them, this area. Again, I throw that out there. I don't have really an answer to it, but it's a meditation. At least I think about that. Why did it happen there? Well, it happened there because the explosives were there, I guess. The explosives were there because of incompetence and because the warnings were given and it was totally ignored, according to news reports, that the prime minister and the president knew about these things, and yet they continued to do that. So it's an indication of the indifference that exists within the country. I don't know, Samra, but.
Samra, you used the expression aesthetic of violence, and that's a really striking way to think about it. And I know as long as I've been studying the region as an outsider, Beirut, that's the aesthetic that I would associate with Beirut that really captures it. But Father Ellis, I wondered about your perspective on Beirut, the history you have with Beirut and with Lebanon. Does aesthetic of violence capture what Beirut is?
I'd like to hear a little bit more what Samra means by the aesthetic of violence. In other words, aesthetic, I picture something that's beautiful and constructed, that carefully put together and all this, but I don't see that in the Beirut. I see violent destruction. I don't know what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so of course, I was impressionable as a teenager when I went for the first time, and I had never seen a bullet hole before. I had never seen that level of destruction with my own eyes. And that really stuck with me. And I think I go every year, sometimes multiple times, and it's always struck me that the physical impacts of the war are still prevalent throughout the city. So I'm thinking of something like the old cinema that was destroyed, the egg-looking cinema that is near the Hariri mosque. That structure has just stayed there. So it remains present in people's everyday lives. There are, at my grandmother, my aunt's houses, the same bullet holes in the buildings around there that I would see. They've become sort of part of the landscape for me. And I think as someone who obviously did not grow up, it was never normalized for me. And I've always wondered what it's like to live in the presence of constant reminders that this city was home to that kind of conflict. Of course, that's not the only thing that I think about the city. I love the city in so many ways. I love the people there in so many ways. But I do think that there's a way in which these multiple crises have been imprinted on the city that is apparent to people who are from there and people from the outside, like myself.
Yeah, one of the things when I visited the especially Martyr Square, and I think in the old Beirut, that was really a hub, and now it seems so desolate in terms of what's around it. I mean, it's the focal point, and perhaps appropriately, is the martyrs, which Lebanon continues to be martyred, but that statue, which they would have refused to repair, is so full of bullet holes and that type of, and maybe that's
exactly
appropriate and symbolic, really, of Lebanon. But if you see pictures of old Beirut, you see all the buildings that were around there, and the palm trees that were in the center, and all the activities, the taxis, and all the hustle and bustle and all that. All that's gone. It's not it's not there anymore. You don't get that sense of vibrancy. You get the sense of violence and destruction. And I don't know how symbolic that is. I'm not prepared really to delve into that. It is certainly noticeable, at least from my perspective.
Father Ellis, what is your earliest memory of Beirut? What do you think about in connection with it?
My connection with Beirut is I grew up because my parents were immigrants, and my father came to this country as someone who was 17 years old in 1914, and and then he went back about 10 years later and found my mother and married her and brought her back. So I always grew up with a feeling, particularly from my mother's side of the family, but my father too. But my mother was more educated than my father, and she was brought up and educated in the Antonine Nun School up in Azultun and those other places where she was from. And so the place where I grew up, a small town in northern New York, had about 10 Lebanese families. And they were all from the same village, which is called Batuta, which is up in the Meta near Sanin, that area. So what I remember is a constant procession of people, sorry, what I did here, constant procession of people coming to the house with letters for her to read for them because they were illiterate, and for her to also to write the responses, and they just kind of like pop in, and she loved doing it. I know that, but she would, and I can remember how disappointed. I mean, I was like maybe 10 years old or something like that, and they would come and people don't announce themselves, they come, and when they was there, I don't know what was, they were so disappointed that they couldn't know. Could you just? Then they asked me, said, could you just tell me who it's from? The letter, who it's from? And I couldn't read Arabic, it was, one of those things. So my earliest, I kind of like was imbibed. I imbibed it because I was the youngest of 6 in that family, and and somehow I was the one who, I was always interested. We were all somewhat interested, but I was the one that after I graduated from high school, I asked to go to Lebanon, and they let me go. They let me go. I was 16, and I went by boat. I went by boat on this Egyptian freighter Victory ship.
Wow.
Called Muhammad Ali. It was a Victory ship that I had no idea. There were 14 passengers on this ship. My father took me to the New York airport, to New York, to get on the ship, and he took one look at this ship. And he said, "Wow," he said, "it's much, much smaller than the boat I came on in 1914." So it was a strange crew. It was a strange thing. Yeah. So, and then the people on there. I was so naive and all that. I didn't understand. The captain of the ship was Polish. It was international crew. The only people that might have been my age or close to my age were some of the crews that were Egyptian young people, that type of thing. But that was my experience at Beirut. But then the Civil War of 1958 occurred while I was there. And so I didn't really see Beirut. I didn't really have any knowledge. I didn't go there. I was stuck basically in the mountains of Junia, which is to the north of the city. And so that was my first impression, but it was always, the war had a sectarian cast to it, and I don't think it really was, but at the time, that was after, I began, reading and studying about it. It wasn't that, but it was something that was like, like, quote unquote, the Christian population was endangered, and all this stuff. So when the Marines landed, which, everybody looked about it as what do you call it? Saviors coming to save this Christian population. That's what came about, and it was, so that's my earliest impression of it. So when I came back, And I went to college, and there were very little Middle East courses and all that, but I did finish. I was very interested in political science and history. And then when I went my doctorate while I was studying for the priesthood, and I became involved with the Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and I met people like, this is your alma mater, right, Catherine? Michael Hudson, John Rudy, Barbara Stovasser, all of these people that are basically legends, in terms of founding that program. That's what really, kind of like turned me on. So then when I went back to Lebanon, I had a context for it. I had a context of the region, context of what was going on in Lebanon. And especially these people like Michael Hudson who had written about Lebanon and all these things. So that's my impression. And then I was lucky enough to be asked to serve on the board for the Lebanese, what became the Lebanese American University. So I was on the board of trustees. So I got another perspective from an educational point of view, but also, as you know, on boards of trustees, it's basically the wealthy people who are asked to be part of that. Obviously, I did not fit in there, but I think I kept my ears open and my eyes open as well in terms of, okay, this is what's going on in the country. And these are kind of like the elite of the country who are serving on this board. And it gave me certainly another impression, rather than from the, from the rather peasant origins that I came from. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one of them.
That is quite a story. And yeah, it's interesting the way that people's personal connections really do drive how they approach their academic careers, or what it is that engages you. You have these different perspectives. And you mentioned the sectarian element and the extent to which sometimes it's relevant, maybe sometimes it's overstated. One of the things about the recent explosion that struck me was that it was in itself, it was a non-sectarian event. It was, it's political in that it's a result of, as you said, policy incompetence, but the effect that it had, it was hard to overlay a sectarian discourse on that. And I wondered if it might be one of those sort of political moments that challenges one of the dominant narratives that we have.
It's interesting you say that in a way, but I have heard commentators say, not that they thought it was deliberate, but a lot of the damage was done in the Christian sections of the city.
Well, yeah.
That's what you hear, they hit the Christians, like the St. George Maronite Cathedral, I got pictures of that. And I don't know about the Orthodox Church, and around the clock, there's a Greek Orthodox Church, there's a Greek Catholic Church next to each other, and next to the Parliament. And so I don't think, I remember when I was there in 58, just out of high school, and people were furious with the patriarch, Maoshi at the time. They thought he was too, he wasn't strong enough, and that he was too conciliatory, and he was, they called him Muhammad. They called Muhammad Maoshi, the patriarch, that tells you how sectarian that it was all associated with, It's hard to get out of that. And this is what I think about Lebanon in terms of people say, we got to do away with sectarianism. And I wonder, what's going to come back? What's going to replace it? I haven't heard anything about post-sectarian Lebanon, and especially in terms of the way that the parliament is divided in the presidency, who's in charge of what, and is it just going to devolve again into conflict? You get more than I do, or this type of thing. Nobody understands, quote unquote, what it is that they have, what responsibility they have, what privileges they have. I don't know. Maybe Samar, you have a different perspective on this that can help.
No, I think there's a really important point there that sectarian identities are often manipulated in particular ways. And especially in times like this, events in Lebanon are always interpreted through the sectarian lens, even as Catherine said, they're not sectarian by in any sense. I think one of the really vile things to have happened after this is that many people, and this is coming out of some Gulf states, this is from media or just from everyday people, saying that it's too bad the silo protected the southern part of Beirut, because that tends to be where the more poor populations are, where the Shia populations are. So it is true, as Father Ellis said, that Christian areas were disproportionately impacted, but there were people sort of saying, "Oh, it's too bad that the silo was there. It would have hurt people that we don't like." So certainly there's a way to interpret this through a sectarian lens. It's vile, it's awful, it's inhumane, but people nevertheless do it. I think that one of the interesting things that has been happening in Lebanon since the You Stink movement from a couple of years ago is that I think there's a lot of momentum towards thinking about what a post-sectarian Lebanon might look like. I think people in the country have a really deep understanding of the granularity of sectarianism, how it affects people's everyday lives, how it structures how they live, so for example, exchanging property. It is very well known in Lebanon that in so-called Christian areas, you are forbidden by custom not to sell to Muslims. So you might be able to rent, and so there are all these practices that are codified in law and that are practiced that I think prevent us from imagining what a post-sectarian Lebanon may look like. But I think that the protest movement that was happening before the pandemic, this is precisely the dilemma that everybody is in, that there's a sense of security in the sectarian system. Because there are so many different communities in Lebanon, everybody wants to know the basic question of how are they going to be safe? Who's going to protect them? How can they ensure their safety and security in the country? And for so many decades now, that answer has been the sectarian system. At the same time, those same people can see the sectarian system as negative, as unproductive, as cancerous, as producing the kinds of conflicts and explosions and economic collapse that we're seeing now. So I think it is a very, very difficult situation, because ultimately at the end of the day, people of all sects want safety and security and want to be able to live in their country freely and safely. And it's tough to think of a political system that is so entrenched. It's very difficult to think about upending that. But I think that is what many people in Lebanon now are trying to do.
That's an interesting way to frame it, that you have a sectarian constitutional order, so it's a political obstacle to developing a shared national identity, but you also have basically a state that has failed. And so of course people need their other communities to provide what the larger political order might provide in other places. And it's difficult to ask people to give that up without an alternative that is clearly envisionable and workable. And even as a political scientist, I'm not sure what the tools for that would be to create that kind of change and institutional development that you're talking about. It's easy to see, Father Ellis mentioned earlier that you get this sort of exodus, you get people leaving out of despair, and it's easy to see why that might be some people's only option.
Well, you see that also, Catherine, in the cases of Hezbollah and armed, and, whenever Nasrallah says something, he kind of like, he doesn't brandish the AK-47, visually, but it's always there, that threat of violence and force is always being said. You mess with us, then this is really what's going to happen. So that is kind of like certainly I think, at least it appears to me to be a rather vivid demonstration of what sectarianism can do to the country. You know, but again, I'm not saying there's not reasons for the way it developed the way it has, because, you know, Shiites have been traditionally, you know, the third class, and you know, especially among Muslims and all that, and how they had to assert their identity, and also you know, their economic status, and, you know, through their migration to Africa and all these other things, and coming back and building, you know, particularly the southern part of Lebanon and all that. So there's all, it's very, very obviously very intricate, but we're faced with a situation today where sectarianism seems, rather than saying that it's going to disappear because it's not good for the country, it seems to be reinforced all the time.
Do you think that will be one effect of the humanitarian fallout from the explosion, that people have to turn even more to sectarian organizations?
Well, if the certainly if the sectarian organizations are the only ones have the distribution of funding for relief, yeah. But I don't know if that's actually happening, though. I think the relief is certainly more non-sectarian. If I understand correctly, I don't know. Maybe so the same, or you have a different perspective on it, or you can elaborate on it.
Yeah, I actually, given the time frame, I think that's correct. That's what I'm certainly seeing as well. That there are a lot of organizations and networks that I think maybe began in 2006 with the Israeli invasion. Some of them have stayed, some of them have been reactivated, and there is an attempt to. I know from inside of Lebanon, there's an attempt to encourage funds not to go to sectarian organizations or party organizations. The really big fear in Lebanon now, or I mean, there are many fears, but one of the fears is that any humanitarian aid will be filtered through the state. And as we know from decades of the state leaders doing this, that will be used as patronage. It will be not be used in the kind of sense of providing national relief, but it will be very much directed at specific communities.
Mm-hmm. Siphoned off also.
Yeah, of course. And this is, I think your point, Father Ellis, about the damage done to the area that was reconstructed is a really profound one, because there really isn't anything to show now for the reconstruction period. There's very little to show, because the core of the reconstruction was focused on that area. If you go a few miles outside of that radius, there are people living in buildings that are still destroyed. There really wasn't that level of investment and development outside of the core of Beirut. And with that destroyed now, it really, I think it demonstrates the failure of the post-conflict reconstruction project that began in the 90s.
As I recall that process, you know, which Solidaire and Hariri were very much involved in, that they confiscated a lot of the land in order to do that.
Yes.
And that,
yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there were people who felt they were adequately compensated for that, if they were compensated at all, but it was a big bone of contention that somehow the government was coming in basically under a organization called Solidaire, run by the Hariri family, what have you, and now it's all gone. You know, not even gone. It's ironic.
Well, yeah, I mean that is one of the most naked acts of corruption in Lebanese history, that the prime minister established a private company, and that called, you know, Solidaire, and then in his capacity as prime minister gave Solidaire the exclusive rights to reconstruct Beirut. I mean, this is you know, if you were teaching a course on corruption, that this would be the best case study. And what they did then, and there is the fear of this happening as well now, they had created laws that allowed Solidaire to take over certain properties. But the valuation of those properties went as far back as the 50s in some cases, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So people were not receiving adequate compensation. They were forced out of their homes. There is, if both of you remember, there's the St. George Hotel for the longest time had a sign that said "Stop Solidaire." So the owner of the St. George's Hotel had actually managed to prevent the hotel from being confiscated by Solidaire.
There's still a sign on the St. George Hotel. I'm sure, I don't know if
Yes.
it's still there, but it's something.
Yeah, there is something there.
Like,
That's right. Yeah. And that ironically and sadly is where Rafi al-Hariri was killed, right in front of the
Right in
St.
front of
George
it.
Hotel. So the hotel itself was destroyed. The owner was a kind of political thorn in Hariri's side. But yeah, there's a fear that this will happen again, that this will be used as an opportunity by the political elite to somehow come up with a new version of this model.
Right.
It doesn't sound like either of you are particularly optimistic that that sort of thing won't occur.
Give us something. Help us to be optimistic.
Well, what is the most hopeful thing that you see arising in the last few years in Beirut or in Lebanon more broadly?
From my perspective, it's the youth. The fact that they're out there demanding reform and really, putting up with it. I mean, it's the same thing here in this country where you see the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the other stuff, where there's a violent component to it, which they say are not really part of the movement, but nevertheless they see it as an opportunity to create problems in general, chaos. But I think in Lebanon, I see the young people too, but there is also I don't know if it's exactly, comparable to what the Black Lives Movement is doing in this country in terms of demonstrating for justice and for equality and that type of thing. But certainly in terms of governmental reform, the Lebanese are doing that. So the young people are there doing that, and but there is violence associated with it. But that tends to, as we know, even in this country, tends to, people say, well, yeah, look at it. They basically want to. I don't think in Lebanon they have a defund the police movement yet, but it's that type of thing that somehow is going to upset the security of the people somehow. But it's there, and whether or not it can be, developed into more structural change, I don't know. You see the whole thing going on in Ukraine today. Not Ukraine, Belarus. The young people marching, to overthrow it. So what, 26 years this guy's been in charge, I'm amused in a sense by saying this is the last dictator of Europe. Are they kidding? The last dictator in Europe? But at any rate, you see it all over. It's young people who are doing that, and there's still that spark there that wants justice and freedom.
That is quite hopeful. I like that. Samer, please agree with that.
I totally agree. I could not agree more with Father Ellis. I actually, in a way, the last few years in Lebanon have been exciting, even though they have been very difficult for people living there. I think that there's an attempt to create a movement that is non-sectarian, that is grounded in justice and equality, and wants to achieve that. And I think that people have suffered a lot. The crises have accumulated in the country. It's generational. It's not just one generation that has suffered, it's many, many generations. It's funny, when Father Ellis said the Civil War broke out, I initially thought he was talking about 75. I had the timing wrong, and then he said 58.
Well, that was later. I can do that too.
but this
I was there then also.
This is an example. What is the war generation in Lebanon? There's so many war generations. There's so many generations that have suffered. And I think that people understand that. That's not a minority opinion anymore. I think it's a majority opinion. And the question is now, how does that energy transform into something that makes people's lives safer?